Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 10th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be talking about Russia's attacks, missile strikes on Kyiv, advances towards Bakhmut. Is this a last gasp of Russian military effort? Let's get into it. Okay, so first and foremost, we will check the map, and as you guys can see here, Ukrainian forces continue to press Russian lines all across the Oskil River front, pushing the Russians back at very, different places, but none of them are like huge encircling gains. And as we talked about previously, I think this is part of a Ukrainian effort to keep the Russians on their back feet, not to let them dig in. And to continually be making incremental gains just to make sure that Russians aren't able to build defensive earthworks, structures, ground lines of communication, everything they need to hold a position through the winter when fighting gets a little bit tougher. When we look to the south, though, this is, I found most interesting. Russian forces are continuing to advance towards Bakhmut, and this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Even though there's very limited Russian combat power, they have simultaneously appeared to have attacked across this entire salient towards Bakhmut. As you can see here, they advance directly east of the city, they advance to the south of the city, and while none of these gains are particularly operational, it more or less trading tit for tat with the Ukrainians in the north, what I find fascinating and perhaps telling is, again, the fact that this wasn't a singular coordinated attack, but this was a broad push across a salient. And we'll take a look at the south of the map, and then I will share my theory in a little bit. Well, you can see here, Ukrainian forces, of course, are continuing to advance into Russian territory, actually starting to push them back and create perhaps what could turn into a small flanking maneuver. You can see it right there, right by, let's see, the village of Slashleve. As we've discussed, right, being able to cut the enemy off behind their lines is a really effective maneuver in this conflict that both sides have utilized. And so if they can turn this break into something that's going to threaten to cut off Russian forces here, they'll be forced to withdraw towards Kherson again. And as we've talked about in previous videos, there's just not a lot of roadways here. And as the rainy season kicks up and the idea of passing through some of these muddy fields becomes more and more difficult, it's going to be easier and easier to cut off Russian forces. Think of it like a heart attack, right? If your heart has, for some reason, hundreds of arteries to it, well, it's going to be very hard to give you a lethal heart attack. I'm not a doctor. Please just bear with me. But if you only have two arteries feeding your heart and one of them gets cut off, the risk could be tremendous. And that's what the Russians are seeing here, right? Only two major ways in and out of this spot. And if they can be severed, or in this case, yeah, it looks like there's only two that are going to run you north to south. If Ukrainian forces can threaten both of those, then Russian forces here will have no choice but to withdraw yet again. Okay. We also, when we look at the news, we see that the Russian military has launched a volley of cruise missiles at Kyiv. And when we look at what exactly is targeted, in some cases, they appear to target bridges. They appear to allegedly target hospitals, what we would consider non-military targets. Now, there's two ways we can interpret these events. The first is that they're largely unconnected, that these cruise missiles are probably launched from a ship in the Black Sea Fleet or a site in Russia. They launched allegedly 83 of them with about a 50% success rate, which that's a tremendous, tremendous number of cruise missiles. I'm honestly surprised that's probably a significant portion of the operational cruise missiles still in the Russian military inventory. But one interpretation is that these are the missile strikes and the advance towards Bakhmut are unconnected events, and that the that this was done by Putin directly in a response to the attack on the Crimean Bridge. And this is pretty probable simply based on the fact that only 83 missiles, right? That says that this is probably personal. This is not symbolic. This is not tit for tat. This is not even a reminder to the population of Kyiv that that they're still in a conflict zone. This is an actual effort to really do some significant damage. And if my estimates of the total Russian cruise missile arsenal are about right, it would take Vladimir Putin to authorize throwing this much of their arsenal at this city. And that, of course, these advances towards Bakhmut that we've talked about, that these are just the efforts of probably the Wagner mercenaries who are paid based on territory seized, and that they just sort of all pushed across this salient. There are some reports that, let's see, we can see it here on the Institute for the Study of War, that there has been allegedly a large number of unsuccessful attacks in the Bakhmut and Avdiivka areas. So it says Ukrainian forces report that they repelled over 30 attacks in the area and in the area of Bakhmut, which would make sense, right? Again, like the cruise missiles, if you throw 30 attacks at the wall, some of them are going to make marginal gains. So, and there's also reports that there were similar attacks repelled near Donetsk city. Why is this significant? Well, these could just be unconnected events, but they could also be Russia or perhaps even Putin, someone who doesn't have, remember, any tactical training. He doesn't have military experience. He was a KGB agent. He focused on intelligence, a very different world than military, especially at the operational and strategic level. So I think it's actually possible that these are two events that Putin has ordered somewhat impulsively. He's ordered a large portion of his cruise missiles deployed to Kyiv, and simultaneously is ordered all of his available combat power to push simultaneously. And the reason I say that is because these broad-based assaults are not what you would expect from a planned attack, right? Even if you're the Wagner Group mercenaries and you're paid by the kilometer, what you want to do is use what's called mass. And mass is the idea that you don't attack across a spread out line, right? Like hammering a nail. You take the weight of the hammer and you put it all into the head, right? And by doing that, you increase the momentum and you allow kinetic energy to focus in on one point. It's like driving a spike into the ground, right? You would never drive a spike into the ground that is flat. You'd want a spike with a nice sharp tip. That's what mass is in military strategic thinking. It's the idea that you're going to concentrate your forces where the enemy is weak, and then you're going to have them all push against one weakened enemy unit. And like driving a spike into the ground, that's what's going to allow you to thrust deep into the enemy's defensive positions. This hasn't happened. And the reason is because to achieve mass, you have to reposition some forces. You have to pull forces out, finagle them, move them, and give them a coherent plan of how this attack is going to happen. It takes time. And the fact that just everyone seems to have picked up their guns and with minimal planning or foresight just pushed in directions says to me that this was not part of a planned attack. This was part of an ordered offensive. Someone came down and said, hey, you are pushing within the next 12 hours. And if you want to attack within 12 hours, basically this is what it's going to look like. Get out of your trenches and charge at the enemy. So I think this is actually Russia's potentially one of their late or last gasp efforts at a major push, a major offensive. It would explain the relative ineffectiveness, their willingness to deploy a lot of their tools, and the marginal gains that have resulted. Operational commanders on the ground probably knew that this was not the play. that the smart play is going to be to lock their defensive lines in place and try to slow the momentum of the conflict as the winter sets in, and use the winter as a time to bring in those mobilized conscripts, give them 3, 4, 5 weeks of training, let them integrate into their units, and then in the spring, try to regain the offensive. Obviously, Putin doesn't want to listen to this, because if he listened to reason, he would never be in Ukraine in the first place. But I think what we're seeing here is the max deployable Russian combat power. And in that context, these gains are looking pretty small. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me. As always, of course, I'm on the road, so I cannot shout out my Lieutenant tier patrons, but I thank all of you. I've had a bunch of new ones sign up, and Patreon is the place for the uncensored content, the combat video breakdowns that I can't even post on YouTube. YouTube obviously has been cracking down quite a bit on censorship, demonetizing, limiting ads, all of that. So everybody that supports me on the Patreon, I really appreciate it. Of course, also, if you want to support the channel, you can always go to ground.news. My link is in the comments and description. And Ground News, as we can see, lets us see how the same story is reported across the political spectrum, lets us see ownership, factuality, and partisan bias, essential in any conflict involving Russia and disinformation. I'll see you guys in the next one.